I'm Ari Redbord.
And I'm Isabella Chase.
Welcome to TRM Talks. TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software.
You join us today for our latest TRM Talks policy after a quarter of policy consultations and ongoing debate, and on a day of really big releases. Earlier, the EU released its single euro package that could underpin a potential digital euro. And at TRM, we launched our very first illicit crypto ecosystem report, which maps just how interconnected the illicit use of crypto has become and really underscores the need for policy that is really well informed by these ever-evolving risks.
So as if your day for crypto content couldn't have gotten any better, we welcome Georgetown University Law Center, my alma mater's inimitable Chris Brummer. Really, really excited to have you join TRM Talks Policy today, and really excited to just kind of dig in with you.
Yeah, I know. But Super Wednesday of sorts, I guess, from Brussels. Lots of interesting stuff happening.
Really so much, and so much globally. But since we are in the U.S., at least the two of us are, let's start there. How, there's so many different aspects to this, but how are you seeing the U.S. environment today when it comes to sort of crypto policy and regulation? What's sort of top of mind for you?
Wow. So big question.
Big question.
Like, how do I view the United States? Every country, and I was talking to some folks just this morning over in the UK, and I said, look, every country is making its own sort of set of choices. I would dare say that the U.S. context remains unclear because we don't have not just sort of clarity in a generic sense, but I do think that people are still trying to define what the direction of U.S. strategy for crypto assets will be in the United States, even amongst the industry, in part because there are, with new facts, and then you have different parts of the government that may respond in one way. And then I think that other parts of the government may feel the need to kind of adjust or correct or in light of what other actors are doing. We certainly had a roadmap that was provided, with the heads of government and the Treasury Department. It's interesting because I haven't taken the time to really think about it in depth, but it would be an interesting exercise to sort of look at that map and to see to what degree the governmental responses up to this point in time sort of map the original instructions and guidance and declarations that were made from the administration. So I think, though, that some things are coming to a head that may not necessarily have immediate repercussions regulatorily, but because the sense of strategy in the government and the overall place as to where we are tends to be a little bit more in flux, that really what's happening even on the Hill is either going to be a refinement of or a reassertion of some kind of a sense of strategy. And again, it may or may not necessarily play out legislatively, but these conversations on the Hill still have some real importance.
No, that's really helpful. It's interesting. I was in a conversation recently with Jeremy Allaire of Circle, so I'm not going to take credit for this but I thought it was a really nice framing. And he said, "Look, we're at a really unique moment in our history when it comes to cryptocurrency policy, in that we have every branch of the United States government now fully engaged." Right? You have the executive branch, obviously, with the White House framework, followed by this series of enforcement actions from SEC and CFTC and DOJ and Treasury, right? And then obviously now we have major cases in the courts when we talk about SEC versus sort of giants, in the space, Binance and Coinbase. And then I think, kind of to your last point, while we haven't seen a lot of like actual action within the legislative branch, there are a bunch of different sort of frameworks out there. There are drafts. So the government is engaged. Like, this is not a situation where we thought maybe post FTX we'd say like this isn't even a space worth regulating, which I think was a real sort of bad scenario, right?
Yeah.
It's engaged, whether we like it or not, I guess, in some respects.
Yeah, and I think there are always, let's call it, exogenous events, that can impact the course and the trajectory of regulation, and for crypto assets. The conversation on AI is interesting because on the one hand, now this is, oh my goodness, like maybe I've just lived in Washington really, really too long. But my original thought was, oh, okay, that's going to eat up the calendar, in terms of how much, literally, how much floor time you're going to have to be able to talk about other kinds of issues, in the emerging technology space. Obviously, from a market perspective, crypto is going to have something interesting to say about AI, and vice versa. But right now, I'm just sort of putting on my DC hat. Was okay. Well, that's going to just eat up a lot of attention. In terms of a narrative, whatever that narrative is, ultimately, crypto digital assets are part of a larger conversation about technology that I think that the United States is having at the moment, in terms of, like, quite frankly, how do we feel as a country about change that takes place in the form of new technologies, uh, and that's bigger than crypto. And so something like AI will have kind of a back end impact on just the overall narrative about technology. And I think that sometimes people may miss that a bit. And then, to your point on the regulatory enforcement actions, even that, and obviously we're going to see this play out in the briefing. And I was over at a sort of a joint event over at the IMF and the Fed, and I told the central bankers there, I said, in one way, you can see sort of Act One being the digital asset space, Act Two being the policymakers and the regulators. And I said, you guys haven't seen Act Three yet. And they're like, what's Act Three? I said, the courts. Because what happens in the courts over the next couple of years are going to define not only sort of the direction of crypto policy, but it's also going to have some real repercussions both in those cases and in other cases coming to the courts about the power of administrative agencies, and what kind of tools are going to be at their disposal to enforcing whatever those rules ultimately look like, both legislatively, regulatorily, and in terms of how the Supreme Court decides to either address or not to address, or to affirm or not to affirm underlying securities law, case law.
Fantastic. I am going to let Isabella take you sort of to the more friendly confines globally for crypto. But before I do, just really one quick reminder, folks, please put questions in the chat. We will answer them. Chris has said no holds barred today. No, I'm just so please put questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them as we continue.
Absolutely. And I suppose actually just one question, Chris, if that's Act 3, what's Act 4? Is that where we reach a happy equilibrium of refining frameworks that are really effective and efficient?
Well, I mean, usually, under the U.S. system, Act 3 ends with the courts, right? And what's going to be interesting, and we've seen already, on just very core questions like, when I watch crypto Twitter, and maybe this is just being a little bit too much of an old law professor, and I sort of see things that come across the wires, and I'm like, well, a lot of these cases are much more, they involve more issues, than some people may suspect. And the range of decision making, the way that a judge or a justice can come out on a case can be very, very, very surprising, right? So you can come out saying there may have been the offer of a security, at T1, but then in that same case, you can make a judgment about what secondary trading means, and what, if anything, the Howey test, means for tokenized assets themselves. I mean, like just the range of the spectrum and the range of potential decisions is the space is broader than I think other or many people may fully appreciate. Which means if you're going to get into the Act 4, it's like, let's call Act 3, if this is a story, like the climax, but then you have the action, what is it called? The declining action. I can't remember from elementary school, like the action that happens after the climax. And I think that that's what you'd have. But then you have to have either regulatory responses to, or legislative responses to, those Supreme Court decisions, and responses even by the market to how they want to think about what the sort of legal base layer, now with more clarity, presumably how that's going to impact what they do as market actors.
Great. Well, we look forward to it. But let's take a step back from the US for a while and cast our eyes around the world outside of the US, and before we jump into sort of the UK and the EU as well. Where around the world is catching your attention at the moment in terms of interesting things for policy and innovation?
It's fascinating because I think if you're going to read a lot of the I guess news reports, certainly what's happening in Asia has to be kind of interesting to you. I mean, when you think about Hong Kong, and now that they've moved to really provide clear rules for exchanges and trading, and so therefore putting themselves a little bit in line with Japan for sort of a retail trading crypto environment. That's pretty interesting. Japan, I believe there have been like elections now, and so Japan is, which will empower Japan to be even more, I guess, cutting edge, maybe, when it comes to their approaches towards crypto assets. I was talking to a colleague who had said, and I'm sure you've heard this before, but Japan kind of feels like many folks in Japan feel as if they missed out on Web 2. And so now, there's a real interest in making up for lost time, if one will, in being real players in the Web 3 economy. But, the kinds of things that I find kind of interesting are a little bit closer to home. I find what Brazil is doing super fascinating. And I think it's interesting because it's a whole of government approach a little bit. So when you think about what they're trying to do, and with the digital real, is fascinating. But underpinning even that is a faster payment system, and that faster payments is really looking to ensure a kind of financial inclusion that kind of appeals to my own professional interests. Let me just take a quick step back as to why I think this is particularly interesting. When you have a faster payment solution that's already been introduced, I can't remember the actual numbers, but something like, the penetration now is like 80%, I think, over in Brazil. Half of all people who have never had digital payments are now, have been introduced into digital payments through the Pix payments platform. The fact that even after going down the route of faster payments, that you're also now looking to introduce a CBDC, and on top of it, that CBDC that they're introducing is one that is thinking of their digital currency as not just a payment system, but almost as a platform for other kinds of services. That's interesting. Like, so when you say, what's interesting, like, what could I write papers about? Like that's pretty interesting, because now you're getting into a central bank and a regulatory authority that's looking into what possible use cases are available. So insurance, I think they've teamed up with Aave and maybe Uniswap, and sort of exploring different kinds of use cases. So that's interesting. Like okay, so you already have payments. Clearly, there's a sense that the technology is useful for payments. It's clearly, useful for settlements. Certainly, really thinking hard about CBDCs, but moving even a step further to look at a wider ambit of financial services. So, like Brazil for me is like super, super, super kind of interesting from a DLT, blockchain, and crypto standpoint.
Yeah, it's so interesting when you see those markets that had the positive trend during the pandemic of a really rapid acceleration in digital payments, who've kind of said, okay, so we've really improved our faster payments. We've got a huge consumer base that's now really familiar with mobile banking, and now let's leapfrog that into in the DLT world. It's kind of like taking the old Kenyan model of being like, well, we're just going to surpass banks and go straight to mobile money. And now we're saying, okay, well, we're going to surpass maybe, I don't think there's really an equivalent, but we're going to go straight to DLT, and we're going to make that platform based. I guess the question that we would then have is around sort of how do we ensure that it's really interoperable in a cross-border settings, because it's great if you've got a really integrated domestic payments infrastructure, but in a region of the world that has such a large diaspora, it's crucially important that we have that interoperability as well.
Yeah, just 2 points on that. Number one, which is always worth adding. Countries that feel like they have something, you know, regulation is always interesting because I always tell people, including my friends who are regulators, I said, always remember with regulation, uh, you have something. If you make a change, possibly you have something to lose. But by remaining in the status quo, you also have something possibly to lose, right? Like it's not like this kind of zero sum game where if you don't do anything, you stay with the status quo, right? Like in other words, non-action is a choice as well. So you have to be very very careful about where do you want to do something, and then where do you want don't want to do something. And clearly in Brazil, they've come up with the choice, or with the sense that given their financial inclusion challenges, and given where they sort of feel like they are in terms of development, that it's going to be, that the status quo isn't good enough, and B, they want to make some upgrades, not just from an international competitive standpoint, but also from literally delivering for core services for their population, right? And I just find that interesting. To your interoperability point, you have international organizations who are now trying to get into that conversation of interoperability. So, the Bank for International Settlements has sort of introduced the concept of a unified ledger, and this idea of how it's interesting because that unified ledger approach, which also Brazil is exploring, is both this it's domestically. Starts with the T1, but then like at T2, what does it look like internationally? But how do you combine what is ultimately a kind of a kaleidoscope that a normal central bank has? Like, people think of central banks as this all-seeing eye, eye of Mordor or whatever, Game of Thrones eye that can moves around and looks at everything. But or maybe that is a pretty good thing, like the eye doesn't see everything because sometimes the eye is focused on one thing. The eye theoretically can see everything, but it's not always seeing everything. But when you think about in the United States, you have the ACH, you have Fedwire, you have all these different kinds of ledgers of sorts, of payment systems, right? But they're not necessarily unified. And then you think a little bit more about what tokenized assets mean, right? And whether or not the tokenization of assets means that you kind of push assets into a space where they can, they assume some kind of exchange value, or that they themselves are underpinned by, I guess the BIS would say, a CBDC. It starts to get in this question of like, how do you put everything kind of together? And if you can do that on a domestic level, you know, could you, or to what degree would that be possible internationally?
I think you guys, it's cool that you've gone exactly where you've gone, right? When I think about sort of the biggest challenges in crypto today, it's not this question of commodities and securities in the U.S. It's really even not the question of frameworks globally. It's use cases, right? Like, what are people doing out there in the world that's harnessing the power of this technology, right? Cross border value transfer at the speed of the internet. And it's cool to see us go right to Brazil, a place where I think is experimenting more maybe than other places globally with use cases. Rebecca Reddick from Polygon is coming on in a couple weeks to do a TRM talks with us on some DeFi stuff. Has done a great job of collecting them, but I think there's just a lot more work to be done in identifying sort of the places where people are already today harnessing the power of this technology.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I think the industry can kind of learn, or at least for its own benefit, is that number one, people obviously still don't necessarily understand the technology, right? So explainability. It's something that you usually associate with like machine learning processes and AI, generative AI or something. But that explainability part is really important, and Rebecca's work has been critical in doing that. But also, part of that explainability is making sure that you have uh, products that solve real world problems, and that those products are highlighted, cataloged, encouraged, because when they are, it makes it a little bit easier, I think, from a regulatory perspective, to really uh, sort of support the technology, because you understand it better, and then B, you can see where you're delivering sort of real value, and you're seeing now, lots of those kinds of instances, and again, you see even government getting involved. One of the really most underlooked things, I don't know if you guys saw this, but you saw, even when it came to the unified ledger, the IMF, of all institutions, is talking about and proposing, starting to kind of, build or sandbox, that concept. And it actually released that maybe a day or two before the BIS um, uh, uh, annual economic report had come out, which is super interesting. Like, so you have like this lender of last resort sort of institution that is thinking about what a unified ledger should look like from a building perspective. So you're going to get those kinds of things, and whether or not it's from the IOs, from the international organizations, or the central banks, or to the startups, or some combination of the three, which is what you're seeing over in Brazil, you know, delivering on use case exploration, use case builds, and use case deliveries are going to be really, really important, even as it's done, even as frankly the legislative rules are being built out.
Awesome, super thoughtful. So we're on our journey. We hit the U.S. We're down through Brazil and Latin America. Isabella, I'm going to turn the tables on you here a little bit. Let's talk UK and EU. Sort of a lot has been happening. We had Peter Kirstens, good friends of Chris and TRM's, on to talk about MiCA, which is now actually signed. We're moving towards implementation, which we'll talk a lot more about. But take us a little bit through sort of a quick journey through the UK and the bloc.
Yes, it has been a very significant few months, I would say, in the EU and the UK. But let's start with the EU, and actually just picking up on that point there about use cases. As Chris mentioned at the beginning, today is Super Wednesday, I believe they're calling it. We've got huge packages dropping from the EU Commission, and one of which is on a proposed digital euro, which would be the EU CBDC. I mean, I think CBDC is one of those what is the use case questions that has been thrown around both in the UK and in the EU so much over the last quarter. The papers that have come out today, they're very long, we've skimmed them, look really interesting, very much complement what we've seen in the UK in terms of like, this would be a complement to cash. It is not a replacement. There's lots of provisions around privacy. But I think for now, and definitely over the summer and up until October when a vote needs to happen, we will see a lot of debates in the EU on the digital euro. I mean, this is also complementing to the conversation about broader digital payments, other pieces that were dropped today, including the draft of the Payment Service Directives 3, which for the real digital payments geeks out there is very exciting. It refines, it's an evolution, not a revolution on PSD2, and really takes aim, though, at one of the biggest problems we see in digital payments and crypto at the moment, which is fraud. And how do we create the legislative frameworks that are needed to tackle fraud in the payment space today? So I think that's probably where the conversation in the EU is going to be for the next few months. But what has happened in the last few, of course, we had the really significant finalization of MiCA, as you say, Ari. That's now going to move into the implementation phase. I'll flag that we will be doing a TRM talks later this summer that will look at some of those more gritty issues of we have the text, but how do we put that into practice day to day? Chris, I know you spend some time with ESMA, and we're all looking forward to responding to even more consultations on the RTSs and ITSs and guidance. So certainly all EU policy people will have a busy few months. And then finally, I think the last thing a lot of people are watching is the continued negotiations on all things anti-money laundering. We have the second trilogues going on the anti-money laundering regulation, which will really set out the A to Z of what you've got to have to do as a crypto business and more broadly as any obliged entity in complying with the EU's regulation on anti-money laundering. So that's going to be super interesting as well. Over in the UK, I think we have that sort of similar sense that, I mean, you were saying, Chris, earlier that there's still a sort of a feeling of a lack of strategy or direction. I think in the UK and the EU, that is not the case. We have roadmaps that feel committed to. And in the UK, we've seen the conclusion earlier this month of our main really significant consultation on the UK's future regulatory framework. But it's not all theoretical. We've also seen practical steps into the construction of a proper regulatory framework. It's what we call phase one regulatory response in the UK. So we've had the financial promotions regime that will come into force in October. If you might have missed it, but our Chancellor of the Exchequer today made a statement on FinProms, as they're known, and said, if you're confused whether or not these apply to you, basically, it's if it's finance and you're promoting it to consumer, it's a financial promotion and you're regulated under the FCA. So we're trying to make it super clear for everyone. And then the Chancellor also confirmed that by the 20th of July, we will have the royal assent of the Financial Services and Markets Bill, a huge sweeping piece of legislation, but will bring fiat backed stablecoins under our financial services regulations in the UK. So really, I would say overall, we've had quite a few significant steps made over the last few months in both the UK and the EU. And just really, it's that creation of this quite comprehensive strategy. We all kind of know where we're going now. So
amazing. Yeah, Chris, I was just gonna ask you to jump into that like classic Isabella Chase, super substantive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't do any of it.
Yeah, me too.
I don't know.
That.
Yeah, I'm just a law. I was actually going to pull, the law professor question, of the Socratic. Well, what do you think, Isabella? Because and this comes from conversations I've had recently with with Dan Markova and others. When you think about like the political backdrop, right, of all this regulatory action, I mean, it's so fascinating because what you're seeing from my standpoint is in Europe. I can't remember if this may be the first time where I'm seeing so much regulatory action for crypto assets happening against the backdrop of looming elections, right? So you on the one hand, that the premiership, there will be an election in the UK for prime minister. It is still unclear as to sort of what the Labour Party's attitude will be like. But this is very serious legislative and regulatory action that's happening. I had the honor of being in the UK 2 weeks ago. Talk to some the digital assets team over at HMT and some leaders of FCA, and they're highly competent, very thoughtful people who seem like they're certainly moving in a direction with a strategy. Query, not just in the UK, but also when you get to the EU with elections to the EU, to what degree does that also start to inform things? Because in the EU, in the trilogue, and you start to have new members of the European Parliament, even where there may be consistency, say maybe in the Commission and the Council, are decisions. Number one, do decisions get pushed off till after the election, or is decision making being accelerated, and even is implementation accelerated sort of before or after those elections? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but you do see this very, very, very serious substantive work being done. Politics, qu'est-ce que c'est? Where are they?
No, and one thing I would say is crypto doesn't win elections in the UK or Europe. And we have an awful lot of other problems that will be much, much higher up in the minds of electorates. So in either Europe or in the UK, we're not gonna see it in people's manifestos. Like, I've got a really progressive crypto regime that I want to bring to this country. Um, we're not going to see it. I think to think about what would a Labour election campaign or government look for, I think, we would expect to see much more of a consumer protection angle there, and one that to some extent is more focused on issues like fraud and broader illicit finance. Across Europe, again, I think, and you also pointed to it in sort of the APAC context, that there are regions of the world that feel like they either missed out on Web 2 or fintech. In the UK, we did phenomenally well for fintech. We saw the boost to jobs and wider innovation that seep throughout our economies. I think any future UK government would not want to miss out on the benefits of crypto, but also wants to contain the risk. I think across Europe, that sensitivity about maybe we didn't make the biggest potential out of fintech is reflected in some of the EU conversations. But I think especially in Europe at the moment, there are much wider issues that concern parties and electorates.
How do you like that?
Yeah, that was really good. That was really good,
Professor.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'm going to take us back to the U.S. really quickly to answer a question in the chat, which is a good one, and that's really sort of, hey, who are regulations in the U.S. targeted at? Are these individuals, peer to peer, sort of the crypto, the hope of crypto, or is this sort of or is it more institutions? And I think the short answer is, look, when you're talking about anti-money laundering, where I think this question is sort of directed, FinCEN has been very clear that they see crypto businesses, exchanges, right? Are you exchanging crypto to crypto for fiat? Are you custodying? Are you a broker? Then you have obligations under the Bank Secrecy Act to have anti-money laundering compliance controls. And those regulations, the BSA is very much targeted towards institutions, or those who act sort of more as entities as opposed to persons. Even if you go off of the sort of money laundering piece to sort of the more of the regulatory piece, really we see all of the actions, with exception, either targeted at entities that a regulator believes are doing something improper, or individuals from a criminal perspective, right? Are you actually engaging in fraud or financial crime or money laundering? So I would say to the question, we're really typically not talking about individuals unless you're talking about sort of actual criminal cases where someone has had sort of the criminal intent to sort of commit the crime. So I'll hopefully that sort of helps with the question. But speaking of crypto crime, Isabella sort of previewed for us that TRM today dropped a really, really extraordinary report, humbly, on sort of really all of the risks, to the crypto ecosystem. So a laundry list of sort of what are the actual crimes that we're seeing, bad actors use crypto to commit, but then also the typologies of money laundering. For example, the report talks about 7.8 billion in 2022 paid into Ponzi or pyramid schemes in sort of the crypto ecosystem. It's really sort of a comprehensive data-driven report that really hits in all of these buckets. But Chris and Isabella, what I'm going to ask you guys, I'd love to get your take on, is there's sort of a general theme throughout. And that is, we've moved from sort of the early days where Bitcoin was synonymous with crypto, right? You said crypto, you meant Bitcoin, and vice versa, to a much more complex and interesting, quite frankly, ecosystem that is being used by lawful users to convert funds from Bitcoin or Ethereum to other cryptocurrencies, to stable coins, this conversation around CBDC. But we're also seeing illicit actors, right, attack the DeFi ecosystem. In 2022, we saw North Korea attack DeFi bridges and protocols at alarming scale. We saw 3.7 billion overall stolen from the crypto economy. Much of that was in DeFi, where we're not talking about Bitcoin, right? We're talking about other types of assets. So I say all of that to say, like, Chris, I mean, I feel like you're a really good source for this. Like, you've seen this iteration, and it's overwhelmingly lawful. but we've also seen sort of illicit actors engage. Like, where do you see the ecosystem today? And where do you see it going? And maybe sort of how it's changed a little bit to the point of this report.
I am a consumer of TRM reports, so I'm really looking forward to seeing what's in it. I not to divulge anything that could get me assassinated by the government. No, I was talking to like a very high level or person with who's in the national security space just yesterday, and I think that from a U.S. government perspective, as you all I'm sure know, the question of North Korea and the threat of North Korea persists, and the questions as to what kinds of vulnerabilities may be in the crypto ecosystem and in the decentralized finance space is one that remains a very top priority, really, for the U.S. government. And so I think that some things, the more things change, the more things kind of don't change, and I think that continues. Um, I do get a sense that at the same time, and this is I think pretty common knowledge, uh, the nature of the national security apparatus is sort of thinking about crypto is complex because on the one hand they are seeing threats to financial infrastructure in the emerging technologies, but they're also understanding, and there is a sense of, what does national economic power look like and what does it mean? So the question of national economic security from a defensive posture is important, but so is the question of like, okay, if everybody migrates overseas, what does this mean for our own vulnerabilities, right? And I think that is like frankly, it's not a political question for them. It's just it's a strategic question, and it is one that from everyone, from our intelligence communities to the military, I think are probably aware of. How that trickles down into policy is, I'm frankly unfamiliar with, being because I'm a regulatory guy and not a military assassin trained, whatever it is. But I am aware enough to know that is part of an overall policy mix of conversations that are happening here in town.
It's so interesting that you went right there, because I think it's exactly right. Like, I think even when I first started in this space, I was a national security prosecutor for many, many years. And that was very much immediately post 9/11. And, the Department of Justice stood up a national security division that had counterterrorism as part of that mandate, and a specific section within that division, right? Like, everything was, how do we stop another 9/11? How do we stop, terrorist financiers, et cetera? A couple things have happened over the last few years, right? You have Colonial Pipeline, you have the Ronin attack. And really what we've seen is crypto move from sort of crypto crime, or at least, or crypto related crime, move from a law enforcement focus to that national security focus. Where just last week we saw that same section, or the same division, the national security division within DOJ, stand up for the first time a third pillar, NatSec Cyber, that's going to focus on these types of issues, right? It's that recognition that we've moved to a digital battlefield from that post 9/11 posture that we were in for so long, where wars are fought on blockchains. And I feel like you're having those conversations today, and that's what this report is about. These are the new threats, and they're more essential maybe than just rug pulls and things we're seeing on chain.
And I think that the AI issue is really going to also sort of accelerate that conversation again. If the thesis is correct that blockchains enable tools that can help combat against misinformation, right, because of their immutability and transparency and the like, the question about their utility and their use cases, you see, maybe expanded digital identity use cases. Maybe you have other kinds of tools that come into production that are a response to other kinds of threats from both a consumer protection standpoint, but also from a national security standpoint. And I think that you could have new kinds of conversations happening, even in agencies. People don't really look at it like an agency like the Department of Commerce. The Department of Commerce is, yes, it's responsible for forwarding, being, let's say, America's diplomats for industry, abroad and at some parts even at home. But there's a significant national security apparatus at the Commerce Department. I mean, and you look at the standard setting with NIST and other kinds of things, and I would not be surprised because they have been, for example, the Commerce Department has been extremely engaged in national security kinds of conversations before. You have AI that's popping up, that naturally, they as one of the main organs of government is going to have to get involved in. You could imagine that again, blockchain, crypto, DLT enters into that conversation in a different kind of a way sooner rather than later.
It's an incredible point. When I was a prosecutor, I worked with gun carrying agents from the Bureau of Industry and Security at Commerce who were trying to stop Iran, North Korea, other, bad actors from getting mostly sort of weapons, technology. But I think you make this great point. If wars are fought on blockchains, then AI is more powerful than any missile that you could get your hands on if you're one of these type of nation state actors. I am going to pivot because this is literally a TRM Talks in and of itself. It's such a good conversation. So don't kill me for ending it, folks out there. But I do want to ask Isabella Chase, who is my resident FATF expert, to talk a little bit about what's going on there, because I think it's just a really, really interesting place. And this has kind of been a big week for FATF as well.
It absolutely has been. And I guess just to close off that last point, it's all about having just such a huge toolbox of every from in-person right up to blockchain-enabled tools to be able to solve against every single theater, which just makes everything so much more complicated. But also to the point of sort of infrastructure fragmentation, leaves lots of space for innovation, which is really exciting. But solely in the domain of all things crypto and financial crime. Yes, Ari, as you said, we've got lots of things coming out of FATF at the moment. Last week, we had the June plenary, and just on Monday, the release of the latest targeted implementation report on FATF, FATF standards on virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. And it made for pretty sobering reading, I must say. We're still seeing a really low level of countries really, truly engaging and understanding the risks that they're facing in the virtual asset space. So we see about 75% of jurisdictions who have implemented some form of standard only being partially or non-compliant with FATF requirements. We continue to see really low levels of travel rule implementation and the swathe of issues associated with that, from tools, but also the Sunrise issue, unlicensed and unregistered businesses. To Chris's point, also, it was really underscored the threat that FATF perceives from the DPRK when it comes to virtual assets. We talk about this in our report as well. And for those who attended the virtual asset contact group back in April, the importance of taking the DPRK threat seriously was really underscored when there was various missile tests in the direction of Japan. And so I think that is a threat area that just continues to be so, so important to this international group. They are also looking at those emerging areas of DeFi, peer-to-peer and unhosted wallets. But I think what was quite refreshing about the report that came out, we still very much see a sort of watch and monitor approach taken by FATF to these issues. There was no big sort of statements of required action. It was very much, we still need to see what's going to happen in those areas. There are so many different areas that we can jump into in what the report says, but for the purpose of this conversation and from like a really core regulatory policy perspective, I think one of the interesting points that stands out that isn't super obvious is the sort of discussion you see in the report of total bans on crypto activity by countries, and how these total bans just aren't that effective as a policy. First of all, they're really, really difficult to impose. And second of all, they are often brought about by countries who haven't considered or even like sort of performed a risk assessment. So they don't know if banning actually is the right approach. And it's FATF makes the comment that it tends to be countries who sort of are looking for a slightly easier, cheaper way out of managing regulating this sector. So I think that is a really interesting finding in the report. What they sort of propose is to take the approach suggested by an IMF paper earlier this year that said really proportionate and comprehensive regulatory frameworks are the best way to go. So I think for me, that was a really interesting point that came out, that bans aren't working, but proportionate and crucially really risk-based and data-informed frameworks are what are going to work best in the future to control financial crime risks.
I love that last point. Chris?
What I find kind of interesting is, certainly you saw it in Hong Kong. I think you're starting to see this in India. Is like some of the jurisdictions that were the first to ban are now kind of putting their foot on the accelerator, right? And and there are lots of different theories as to why that's the case. But I think that all else being equal, I'm not trying to make a judgment on anything as to what's right or wrong. People can do what they want, but I think that all else being equal, to the extent to which you feel as if your payment system or your financial sort of infrastructure is antiquated, outdated, and does not sort of move value in ways that you think are optimal for economic development, or you feel like you're kind of stuck at a place and you want to like move your economic development further. In other words, if you're an upstart, right? All else being equal, most emerging technologies are going to be a little bit more interesting for you than an incumbent. It's almost like a normal market, right? If you're already the industry leader, then you may be a little bit more gun shy, you may be a little bit more risk averse, or not. And I think that there's this cycle maybe going on, a little bit of learning and sort of new strategy development, where countries are saying to themselves, this is a sector that maybe we can kind of win in, and it's ironically coming from some of the folks who are the least maybe inclined initially to do so. But you're looking at like large populations, lots of, let's say, if not unbanked, let's call them underbanked folks, right, with a large financial underclass, right? Even when you look at Brazil, right, where countries are sort of saying, all right, how can I use the levers that are available, either through central banking or through my entrepreneurs, right? Again, all those jurisdictions are not Brazil, Hong Kong or India, large entrepreneurial classes. How can I kind of deal with this issue, And yeah, the AML world, AML KYC world, kind of has to adjust to that, right? And if you're trying to coordinate, and it's going to be really interesting because with the travel rule compliance, as you were talking about, like what does that actually mean then in practice, when even the preferences of more than a couple of countries, maybe a year and a half ago, may have in some ways updated themselves, not necessarily changed, but just maybe changed in terms of their preference for experimentation in some way or another. And how does that then impact the oversight and the supervision when it comes to these very hard fought sort of consensus strategies?
Absolutely. And I think also what you've sort of described being kind of like a slow change in perspective, we're going to see a drastic amount of activity over the next 12 months, because the other big thing that came out of this report was the confirmation by FATF that in June of next year, they're going to start publishing a table of the FATF member states and a select other set of countries which have materially important virtual asset jurisdictions. And they're going to be listing exactly what each country has done to implement recommendation 15 and parts of 16. And, this is purely my assumption, but we can only imagine that once that is published, a lot of these carrots that FATF have been putting out over the past 4 years might quite rapidly start turning into sticks. So I would say the clock is ticking on sorting out, if you're not banning, you better be starting to properly regulate, license, and supervise, because
Yeah, and that's like that. Many of your viewers, here, they know that this is kind of like the way it works. With the 40 recommendations, for FATF, not you don't even have to blacklist. I mean, when you look at what the SEC has done with these kinds of lists, it starts off as a kind of a name it or shame, or it may be admissions to certain kinds of policymaking clubs within organizations. It's something that the SEC has done with IOSCO. Obviously, FATF has used the more, the biggest stick of all, when it comes to, accessing banking systems, and, those descriptions being used by different countries as an excuse, or as the authority, or as a catalyst for, some kind of financial sanctions. But yeah, that certainly will concentrate minds.
Absolutely. I'm going to build on this a little bit and probably end with something along these lines. It's interesting when you talk. What you see FATF sort of dabble in emerging issues, right? DeFi and NFTs. But when it comes back to sort of a statement like yesterday, it's implementation, 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 right? Like they're always going back to that. But I feel like those emerging issues have gotten more traction globally, particularly DeFi. We've seen a pretty significant risk assessment from the U.S. Treasury Department. Again, not guidance, certainly not regulation. We've seen a consultation from France that was certainly interesting for the space. But again, not a lot. And you've said this before. What is your take on sort of where we're headed, right? Because, I mean, maybe this is wrong, but I think where we're headed is having to answer the question globally of how we regulate in a truly decentralized space. Not this thing we have today where we can still regulate intermediaries like centralized exchanges, but like this is only the first piece of how you regulate the crypto space.
Yeah, I feel like you're giving my kind of exam, right? You give like a really hard first question.
Well, I did talk about it when
you destroy the confidence of the student, and then you give a bunch of easy ones, and then it's like, oh, no, we're not done yet. I'm gonna give you another devastating answer, so you can't sleep until you get the exams of.
It's so funny because as I was coming up with a question or whatever, I said to myself, I am going to ask Chris like the ultimate Chris question, and that is like just a relatively sort of theoretical, but there's actually now some things you can look back on, questions. So the ultimate law professor question, and feel free to give the ultimate law professor answer.
Yeah. It's like, what do you think? What do you think, Ari?
Yeah.
It's DeFi is interesting because right now regulators, interestingly enough, the U.S. is kind of a weird exception, right? But most regulators have a to-do list right now. Okay, and that to-do list has been the outcome of legislative projects that have matured and have been passed, right? So if you're talking about MiCA, or if you're thinking about what's happening right now in the UK, I mean, you have several iterations of legislation over in Japan. So people are kind of like the nerds are implementing now, right? And they're kind of focused on what the politicians have said, in terms of the overall principles, and that's kind of where that focus is. But as we talked about when it comes to things like MiCA, where there was serendipity in terms of starting a little bit early in that project, but still there are some blind spots, or not blind spots, but they just didn't have enough time to address certain kinds of issues like DeFi. That just the way these things largely work is it's not going to be the regulators who start off with that. Normally it's the legislative political process, and then it flows to the nerds, right? And then it flows to the regulators. The big exception, of course, for that is to the extent to which any regulatory agency has enforcement authority over the sector, or asserts it, and then tries to to enforce rules in ways that kind of set standards, regulation by enforcement, or just plain old enforcement. And that would appear to me to be a more likely short-term outcome, in part because the way things are done otherwise there's a certain process, by which these things kind of get done, or nothing is done, right? Because the calendar is full on the legislative process. The regulators are busily implementing on their to-do list in most countries, other than the United States, where there's not really a to-do list yet, right? Uh, and they're like, hey, we'll get to DeFi. It's still relatively small. They can go through a risk reward calculus where they're saying it's a small sector. I'm going to go and address the larger, bigger issues right now. I'll get to it when I have time, kind of mentality. Perhaps, certainly, the big exception being the AML KYC folks. Right now, I'm thinking about the capital markets perspective, but certainly, the crime fighters, they're going to be looking at DeFi your Department of in the United States, your Department of Justice, your OFAC, your FinCEN folks will obviously be concerned about what happens, national security imperatives, financial crime, and the like. But when it comes, financial regulation starts with what you guys do, because it's literally life or death, right? But then there's this huge world of other things that also have to be addressed. But that huge other world, like from a rules standard setting perspective, I don't have any inside knowledge, but my spidey sense tells me, that could be a little ways off.
Awesome. I'm gonna ask this question real quick because we're kind of on it, and it's just from the chat here. It's a question really do we see a world in which there's a modification of SEC's Rule 121, which basically talks about custody, but it's really sort of this. I think the question is broader, and that is, is it possible that we see movement either from the SEC to modify some of its rules, some of its views at least, or is this something Congress is going to step into? And maybe this is kind of where we leave it.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's a really tough question, and I think some of it is wrapped up in regulation, some of it's wrapped up in policy, and some of it will be wrapped up in what's going on in the courts right now.
I mean, that court question, I've written about it, but that's a longer. Well, maybe it may not be a longer term issue. I mean,
I think it's a longer term issue. Yeah.
Part of it is also just on the court thing. A lot of the initial first impression decisions are going to be made by judges, and they may be singular individuals who may be really sophisticated on securities law, or maybe not, right? And they may have expertise in other kinds of areas. Once you start getting up to Supremes, right, where you have briefings and multiple people, a certain, elections, the history of securities law is informed by changes in the personnel at the court, and what their ideologies are in terms of administrative state, finance, etc. Once you get up to the Supremes, other things start happening. It's not the same as just with other judges, and those kinds of decisions would absolutely impact the decision making. But again, the time that it takes to get to that point, it could be several years.
It's a long time. And what strikes me and what's so cool about this moment, and why I pinch myself that we get to do what we do, is we're now building the case law, right? The precedent for this entire new sort of this world, the digital economy, and we haven't even scratched the surface of it. It's so cool. I mean, I can't even imagine sitting where you sit, where you're teaching this stuff as it happens, right?
I mean, I get to look at people who've been, these experts for years and years, and you get to sort of say, hey, there's some pretty new stuff coming down the pike.
No, it's absolutely awesome. Look, for our viewers out there, I mean, this is what we want to bring to you for TRM Talks, and definitely TRM Talks Policy. These are the conversations we're having, right, at our weekly policy meetings. We're having with sort of luminaries in the space like Chris, and it's so cool. So thank you so much for tuning in. Please check out the handouts tab. It has sort of the report that was released today. Subscribe to the weekly roundup. There'll be a summary of this next week. We're having summaries of a lot of the work that we're doing, plus sort of original content. And Chris, I just can't thank you enough for joining us, and for just what was really a fun, cool conversation.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Learned a lot as well. Always when I talk to you guys. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Isabella, always an honor to have you as my co-anchor, and really looking forward to next time. So again, thank you all for helping us build a safer financial system, and for tuning in.